Hello, I'm Huw Wahl. I'm guest curator of the Becoming Earthly film season at the Barn Arts. And as well as it being a film season, it also contains two sound works, which are actually both made in Manchester, which is where I am as well. And they both explore urban wasteland wasteland and brownfield environments here. And they're both, I guess, in sort of different ways, drawn from ecological themes or contain ecological themes and ideas, and I guess also ways of experiencing space in a way. So yeah, we're here tonight to talk to those makers, and it's nice to have you both here. Hayley Suviste, who is a sound artist and composer, who also runs the Manchester Ear, who do sound walks around Manchester, and David Birchall, who's a performer, improvisational musician, and is a curator of the Curious Ear, another ear in Manchester, which is a series of
it's their gigs of improvised and experimental music. Yeah.
So I guess that maybe the best way to start is just to ask you both to introduce your sound pieces, and maybe just give us a little bit of context around how they came about. And for people that haven't listened to them yet, obviously they can listen to them, then they should do. But yeah, maybe just give a little bit of detail around them would be great. So I don't know who wants to start.
Sure.
David?
Sure, okay. Yes, so my piece is called Pomona, 21st of January 2021, which is the prosaic date that it was recorded and made. And that the sort of wider context for the work I'm doing at Pomona is part of my master's research, where I'm repeatedly visiting the site and making recordings which are, I suppose, a mixture of field recording of what's happening in the place, but also something performed. So I'm actively adding sound as I'm moving around the site, and I'm narrating elements of what's happening, like for me, like on a sort of personal psychological level, as well as trying to bring in just descriptive things I'm seeing, little encounters with people end up on the tape as well. So I guess a big part of what's happening as I'm making different trips there's maybe been 4 or 5 recordings so far, is that the sort of form that is given to the piece is arising very much from what's happening on the site on that day, like the access to the site, because that will change a lot depending on different circumstances and who else is there. So that's sort of been one of the intriguing things about making these repeated journeys there, repeated recordings. So that's a snapshot from January of what's going on in the site and how my processes are sort of engaging with it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and my work, Edgeland. So that's a piece based on one of my local green spaces, Ryebanks Fields, which is also under threat of development at the moment. So the idea of the piece was to shine a light on the activists and like the local community that are engaged with the space and are involved with trying to save the space and prevent it from being lost. So the initial phase of the project was to meet with these people and record them. And then based on our conversations, I went around and recorded places from the site that responded to what they were saying and the sounds that they were talking about. And then kind of weaved a narrative through the work based on the conversations and field recordings, and improvised along with my own music as well. And it came about last November. Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival approached me for a commission, and they asked me to do a half-an-hour piece within 5 weeks. So it was quite a tight process, and I think this was a work that I was kind of thinking about doing for a while, so I think that just kind of kicked me to do it. And I think the next day I got in touch with the all the activists and stuff, and then within 2 days was doing the interviews, so it's quite like a intense process, but yeah.
And that you also went to Pomona as well, I think.
Yeah, so I think it was the main idea was about Rybanks, but then it kind of reached out into all these other places like Pomona and other kind of edgeland and kind of these other spaces around Manchester. That was,
Yeah, so I guess I was sort of thinking about ecology really in general, and how the film season is kind of based on ecological ideas, but not just sort of not directly, I suppose, also in the way that things are made. And I was quite interested in your two pieces because they're both like based in a similar place, similar situations, but you kind of approach ecology and space in slightly different ways. So I don't know if either of you want to say maybe a little bit more about how, or if maybe it doesn't, if ecology kind of comes in or came into how you're, well, either made, or I think, Dave, you're still carrying on making these pieces. If that question sort of makes sense. It's a bit broad, sorry.
No, I think the thing that strikes me always about these sort of spaces is that they're like unstructured, there's space in the city where it's, in the case of Pomona, it's this abandoned dockland, which is now being redeveloped, but has been a really vibrant nature park. And at the moment, I was there today with a friend doing some work, and about a year ago, a lot of the place was raised. So a lot of trees and an environment that was there has sort of been lost, but then is coming back again. So as spring's coming up, you can see this. What was it? I actually wrote this down, because Alex, who I was there with, actually knows what plants are. So there's something called sea buckthorn growing there, which he was aware he was spotting straight away, which is dead interesting because it's a salt. I didn't know this, but it's a salt water plant. It grows by the coast. So somehow it's come I guess on a boat, or somehow it's come down the ship canal 30 miles from the coast and has established itself all over Pomona. And Alex goes there to look for like mugwort and there's other wild flowers and herbs and stuff. He's like quite up on that stuff. So there's that sort of side of the ecological thing where there's a site that's just left on its own to sort of go to seed a little bit. Quite interesting plants take root, and there's a lot of bird life there, and there's sort of space as well for people to do stuff. I guess that's sort of more at the starting point of some of my stuff, is that idea of how unstructured space, like brownfield sites, edgelands, interstice, that's my other favorite term, how like they allow you possibilities or just openness to do the things you want to do. And that we're losing that sort of unstructured space within cities quite a bit with this sort of redevelopment. And that comes in tandem with these sort of ecological things where we're losing green spaces and what they also give to people, but also to the wider sort of environment, and other things that are living in the city, those are going as well. So
I guess those spaces as well, they offer something so different to kind of like the parks that are much more like manicured, and it gives you should have more space to interact with those kind of spaces, I think, and explore, which I think is pretty rare in cities as well. And so I think my work is directly kind of about changing ecologies in a way where I want it to prevent it from changing, and prevent losing these spaces, because without those in the city, it just feels so, I don't know, built up and unnatural. Whereas these little pockets of kind of overgrown land are just, yeah, more exciting and interesting.
Yeah, they're enjoyable on many, you know, any person that goes there sees a different way of approaching what that place could be. You know, like when I was there today, there's like your dog walkers, there's me and Alex sort of doing funny vocal jams and looking at plants. There's like people ragging mountain bikes about it, people setting stuff on fire. It's like people have different things that they enjoy doing there, but it gives that possibility for like a really wide range of behaviours that if you try to do any of those sort of in the middle of Deansgate, that's the main shopping street in Manchester, then you know you'd get in trouble probably.
Yeah, I think that in your piece, Dave, that kind of comes out, those, I guess, in those interactions that you have, that sort of any, you know, different things can happen that wouldn't happen in other places. And it allows that opening up of, talking to random people maybe, which if you sort of, like you say, wandered around Deansgate doing that, it would have an entirely different sense. People would be wondering maybe what you wanted from them or something like that.
There's that sort of feel of countryside rules, isn't there? You know, when you're only seeing people every now and again, so the possibility to interact seems a bit easier.
Yeah, and I guess that, as you were saying, Hayley, that kind of also comes out in your piece directly, that you're talking to people about those kind of spaces that are going to be lost. I mean, it struck me that someone says that, you know, some people say Manchester's a green city because it has a lot of grass space, but as you were just saying, it's kind of what is manicured and what is free to do. I liked it when I think there's a woman who says at the beginning she feels like a child again because the grasses are so high.
Yeah.
That's a lovely part, yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Hayley, if like when you were recording the piece, if it kind of, because I don't know if you're often recording in these kind of spaces, but does that change how you go about making a piece, or does it feel different to record in those spaces? Is it easier to have those conversations, or?
I mean, I feel like these are the spaces that I'm more interested in recording anyway. So it'd be the kind of places I'd go to on my own and explore and find like hidden gems of sound. And then, so that I think with the two activists, we walked around the site together and they showed me around all the historical sites. I asked them about their kind of favourite sounds and like got them to think about the sounds in that space. And yeah, I think the way we explored it was quite interesting. Yeah.
What was I going to say? Yeah, I was sort of, I guess, leading on to say, well, to really ask an obvious question, which is how can sound kind of help us either explore these places or appreciate them, or you know, and you may not be using sound for that reason, but what kind of sound can do, I guess, in these contexts or in this sort of topic.
I think what's similar about both the pieces is that they sort of offer like both comment, but also really, I mean, I loved when I was listening to yours like earlier, Hayley, like the way you can sort of imagine like other possibilities for what that place can be, like through the sort of conversation and the nature of the music. And I think both these pieces have that thing there in them, the idea that through listening to sound from the place and interaction, maybe some information about the place, you're able to build like quite a rich image of what it is like in your head through the listening process, as well as imagining like what it could be, or like what the different visions people have for what it could be or what it has been. I don't know what you think, Hayley, if that's sort of makes sense. Or
Yeah, and I think in kind of spaces like Pomona and Roebanks Fields, that kind of feels even more prominent because they're like threat of being lost, and I think it just makes it even more impactful that you can imagine these spaces in that way. Yeah.
There was something I loved there was one of your interviews in Edgeland is sort of talking about this hope that whoever makes decisions about places or planners or something, there's some comment like that, is listening or is taking note. And I think that sort of cut to the core really of like, for me, why I'm interested in these places is just that thing of like, who has say over what happens where in cities, and how people that live and work and are active in places, like how much say there is in shaping them. I think there's something interesting in this sort of, both the stuff we've done, there's that idea of proposing other, visions of what places could be like, and, how that sort of ground up visioning of like what urban redevelopment could be, rather than the sort of the top-down vision that we've got, which sort of is encouraging like a single economic sort of model based on development, with not much space for the sort of spaces that we're looking at. So yeah, there's that thing of like how people do engage with those processes of change and trying to shape them, and how successful or not you might be in doing that. But people are really, you can hear the voices in your piece. People really care about the spaces and what happens to them. So there's still an open question, I think, of like how can we engage with the places that we live in, and to shape them how we want them to be shaped.
And I think your work really gives a good kind of first-hand account of that, compared to mine, where I'm speaking to other people and they're the voices in my work. You're the kind of center of yours, and we're with you kind of exploring the spaces and interacting with it, and giving that kind of personal take on what it's like to explore these spaces.
I think that sort of like autobiographic thing is a nice thread through it, and I'm glad you get the sense of you sort of almost, I'm taking someone on a little haphazard walk through it and getting to know it, sort of thing.
I think that's also what struck me about, specifically sound, really, when you can kind of listen to it wherever. I know you can potentially, I guess, watch a video wherever these days, but you can lie on the sofa, you can kind of sort of wrap yourself in it, I guess, in a way, which is, there's also a piece in a film in the season that's a silent film, and I kind of had a similar feeling watching that, actually, strangely, that when you take one of, something we're usually used to sort of just thinking very dualistically, I guess, in like sound vision way, that I thought that was, I don't know, that's probably just a really obvious comment to make to two people who make sound. But it was also something that I always think when I've come from maybe like an experimental kind of improv gig, is that all of the tiny sounds that you sort of make around you, going home and just opening the door, suddenly I sort of like feel sensitized to them. So I'm wondering if you kind of think sound can have that place to like resensitize us to these environments.
Yeah, I guess sound is such an immersive kind of format. Because say if you've got your headphones on and you're listening to a piece and you close your eyes, you could like physically imagine yourself in these spaces, and that kind of transformative effect of it. And I guess through Edgeland specifically, in terms of like sensitization, I kind of want to get that across to the listener in the way so they can think about their environment in that way as well. So I guess there's parts in the composition where I've interviewed someone about their kind of favourite sound in Rybanks Fields, and they're talking about the leaves. Then I get recordings of the leaves, and just kind of that really tuning into your senses. And I think that's what I do when I'm on the sound walks as well with the Manchester Ear. It's just that when you really focus on your like senses, you can get so absorbed into that world and understand it in a different way.
Mm.
Mm.
So what's the Manchester Ear, Hayley? It's sort of a...
Yeah, so we just run little sound walks. We haven't been able to do it in ages because of COVID, obviously. But, yeah, so it's run by me and Brian Woods. I think you might know him.
Okay.
And we'll just kind of get a group together, and we'll do a little talk at the start about how we're gonna run the sound walk, and we'll just have like a half an hour walk as a group, kind of quite silently just listening, and then at the end kind of have a conversation about all the sounds that stood out and what we liked and how they related to each other.
That sounds great. Sounds really an interesting project. And I guess that's sort of like, I know one of the, I was looking through the sort of things we might talk about, that idea of acoustic ecology stuff kind of came up, and that's that sort of practice of walking and listening, walking in silence and really being focused is
definitely a
big part of that sort of area, isn't it?
And I guess listening to spaces that you might walk through every day and not listen, you might have your headphones on or you're focused on something else, and having that different approach to it and a different perspective of just fully focusing on what you can hear is really grounding as well, and quite meditative.
There was something interesting I was reading the other day where in this article someone was saying about how to do with memory, like, that feeling when you're traveling like to work or something, or a journey you often make, and you'll go on the journey and then you'll get to where you're going to without any knowledge of having arrived. Like, you've traveled in time and then you've arrived there, but the actual journey you don't remember. But in this article was saying that actually, like, your brain's relying on like old memories of that journey because it's so familiar. So like, you're not making a new memory, you just, if you need some detail of it, it's just from being stored. So it's that interesting thing of like being really present, so you are aware of those little changes and things that are happening around you.
Is there such thing as a sort of ecological sound? I mean, just because in film, I guess people are more and more talking about ecology in film in different ways, in the way that making it more ecological in the way that I guess bigger productions are made, but also kind of thematically and stuff. And I'm wondering if in sound there's a kind of ecological sort of move or anything.
I mean, I guess like from the 70s, people like Murray Schafer and Hildegard Westerkamp, there's like a whole bunch of people in Canada working on what's it called? The World Soundscape Project, I think, that really started to think about, making recordings of places and how much industrial human noise is present, and really trying to think through different categories of sound and what places might have sounded like in the past and what we want places to sound like into the future. So that kind of acoustic ecology movement is sort of developed from the 70s onwards, I guess. And some of it is stuff like noise abatement societies. I think they were one thing that sort of arose out of it. The idea of thinking that sound could be more controlled or thought through in environments. that was one of the things that came from that. And this sort of practice Hayley's talking about, the sort of sound walking, like really being aware of your, like what you hear rather than just passing through it.
Mm.
You might know more about this stuff than me, Hayley, I suspect you do.
There's been a movement kind of more recently that I've noticed during the last year with COVID, is that there've been a lot of sound maps that people have kind of been collecting, getting the public to send in recordings from all over the world of their local environments and putting them on a sound map that everyone can access. And I think there's quite a few of those during COVID, of people collecting how their soundscapes have like changed during COVID. And I think there was a broader kind of move towards that, even if it wasn't kind of explicit, where people, I guess when you just noticed like the traffic noise dying down and the lack of aeroplanes, and that you could hear the birds more even in the cities, I think even if people aren't aware that they're thinking about those things, I think it has become in people's consciousness a bit.
Yeah. Did you record your piece kind of during lockdown then?
Yeah, so because Ryebanksfield is my local green space, it was a space that during lockdown I was going there on my daily walks and taking my field recorder and collecting sounds throughout the year anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Huddersfield, they approached me in November, I already had quite a big bank of recordings from them, and then made more in those 5 weeks as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, in both of the pieces, it happens that you're both kind of composing, either I don't know, as you're going, or afterwards, I'm not sure. And you're both kind of using synthesized sounds, I think, which I'm curious about how that kind of like present deep listening or whatever you want to call it, kind of goes with also composing music, because I know that's, or at least it's something that I find in filmmaking, that music's often quite hard, or I quite struggle with sort of how to put music into landscapes and scenes in a way that doesn't dominate. And I don't think it does dominate either of your pieces. So I'm kind of wondering how you negotiate the music or the compositional side, I suppose.
Yeah, I think with my piece, because it's all recorded in real time, and a lot of what I'm trying to get to in the research is this sort of process-driven things, like what's happening when you're improvising, but with sort of contingent elements. Like when I'm out in the field, I'm holding the field recorder, and I've also using a tiny sampler, which is where the synthesized stuff comes in. So I'm manipulating both of these things, as well as talking through things that are happening and moving and negotiating the site, which is, it's fairly safe in some places and then quite unsafe in other places. So part of the process for me is to be in real time negotiating all of these elements to try and see how they fall together, basically. And there's always a focus on sounds that are happening around me, but there'll be certain, you can hear it in the piece. I think there's probably, at the very start, there's very much the sound of the scrap metal people throwing bits of car around. Mm-hmm. And then there's a piece of organ that emerges and repeats over maybe the first 10 minutes. So there's just a sort of choice making process, I guess, as I'm going along. It's like, what's happening around me that's really interesting, and letting that come to the fore. And then as I've moved away from the scrap metal sort of clanging action, I've gone into a much wider field where there's bits of bird sound, there's things from the canal path, there's building work coming in. And then I've just made the choice to push that, the synthesized organ sort of sample to the fore a little bit. And then a thing I really enjoy doing in those little moments is that thing of making, then pushing the sound, that I'm adding to the front of the field. So you kind of get this thing where you're like, oh, there's a piece of music, and then something will dissolve that, either my voice being really present at the front of the mix or something interrupting it. So then you're kind of pulled back into the space again. So I think those are some of the considerations that I'm trying to use about how I'm adding sound when I'm moving.
So it's like a live composition as you're going, kind of.
Yeah, it's an improvisation, I'd say.
Okay.
Process driven thing, really. Yeah. And sometimes they're successful, and other times, like I was saying, this issue around accessing the site. So other times I'm stopping and starting the recorder all the time because I can't get somewhere that I previously could.
So are any of the musical bits not on site, or is it all done through the sampler?
It's all done on site, yeah. That's the sort of little box I've set myself, the little challenge to try and work in. Yeah.
Don't take your work home with you.
No, exactly, yeah. Stays in the field, yeah.
And Hayley, is yours, how is yours done, I guess?
So I think the basis of the work was fully on the conversations that I had. So that was the first point of view. So at that point, I guess I knew that I wanted to do a work about Rybanks Fields, but I had no idea what the structure would be, what the content would be, really. So it's all fully based on those initial conversations and recordings. And then from there, I make the field recordings and then use the ones that I've made from throughout the year as well to kind of add like the contextual layer. And then kind of based on what they're talking about, I've put it into a narrative and strung it together so it makes sense in a structural way. And then from there, all the synthesized parts, I think a lot of them are improvised along, so I would kind of play along to the kind of talking and the field recordings and kind of create an ambience that I liked and I thought fit and kind of lifted the piece up and worked well. So yeah, I think that's the way I go about it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love how the field recordings and synthesized stuff blend in your piece. It's really beautiful, and like how they're supporting what people are saying, just in really subtle ways as well. It makes it a really rich listen. I enjoyed
I quite like
that a lot.
To blur the lines sometimes between what's like making the synthesized stuff sound really natural and the natural stuff sound more drony, and kind of move in between those two sound waves. Yeah,
it's interesting where what we sort of typically call music, or like where the sound recording kind of goes in. I don't know if it happens in the bit you were talking about before with the trees, but that sort of again felt like I wasn't then quite sure if I was listening to the trees or the person saying that the trees sound like water, and then was I listening to water? So it was.
Because I think I had a recording of some rain as well that sounded like the tree leaves, so I think just blending them and using it as part of the narrative as well. Yeah.
Nice. And are you both carrying on this work in other ways? Are there kind of other projects happening? Obviously, we're sort of hopefully slowly being dragged or dragging ourselves out of the lockdown.
Yeah, well, I'm going to continue making these recordings for another month or two, I think. And then they'll be presented, I think, as a release, as sort of 3 separate recordings that sit together. And I think definitely, having just got used to working outside over the last year and a half, I think I'll probably carry on doing that, even when I can also work in venues again, which will be exciting. But I think the interest in like working outside in these sorts of places will definitely continue. I think the idea of like presenting sort of performances and stuff outdoors as well is something I'm quite quite intrigued by, because I did a lot of rehearsing and playing outdoors with people sort of last summer. So yeah, trying to pull something together around that would be really great to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I'm going to definitely stick to this kind of process of making music, because I found any times kind of since kind of trying to go back and just create abstract music or something that's not related to place, I just can't do it anymore. So yeah, no, I feel really connected to this process of doing it, and I've not got any projects that I'm working on at the moment though. I've got a residency in the summer, so I need to think of something. But I'll work towards that. Yeah.
Well, maybe that is a positive thing then that's come out of the lockdown, is that reconnection to these places. I think a lot of people have felt that.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me, for talking about the work.
Thanks for inviting us. Yeah.
I'd highly recommend anyone watching this to go and listen to Dave and Hayley's sound pieces. They're free. And yeah, thank you very much.